Alright, it's time for me to finish up these boards and get them into the hands of the animator. So let's take a look one more time at everything that I have so far and talk about what I want to do moving forward. First of all, we've got all of our compositions laid out. They're pretty much set the way that I want them. This might change a little bit as I go to finish them, but we've got the first two frames of that katana coming out of the sheath, the close-up of the bullet being split, the one shot of the katana slicing up a potato, the potatoes on the plate with the text, and then a transition frame. We've got the carrot being diced up by the katana with text, the final logo lockup, and then those knives flying into that logo lockup. So, 9 frames. Now what I want to do is decide how I want these to look as a finished product, because right now these are purely just stock photos that were cut out of their backgrounds. So I want to stylize them a little bit to give them kind of an aesthetic. I might want to put in some background textures. Remember, I have those paper textures that I can play around with to see if that can kind of give a unique feel to everything. And I'm also going to want to add in some 2D elements, probably built in Illustrator, so that it just has a little bit more of an actual style and not just these photos cut out, slapped on top of colorful backgrounds. I want to add a little bit more graphical elements to my boards. So let's start by just thinking about how we might treat these photos. First of all, this part right here, if you remember, I masked off this part of the ribbon from this stock photo. These are two separate stock photos, and if I go into the Sheath Smart Object, double-clicking on that thumbnail, that'll open up the Smart Object, and we can see this half of the sheath is separate from this half. And the reason I did that was to extend it out so we could have the entire sheath just in case the animator needs it. But the issue is that this shot was darker. I even brightened it up already, but you can see that that ribbon does not match right here with this ribbon. The lighting is much brighter here. So what I want to do is match this brightness a little bit more closely. I don't want to do it to everything because the hands actually look pretty decently even between the two of them. So I just want to focus strictly on that ribbon. To do that, I'm going to add an adjustment layer, curves adjustment layer, and I want to brighten it up a little bit, and then what I want to do is mask it off so that it's just affecting that ribbon. So I'm going to invert this mask by clicking on the invert button in my properties panel, and that way it's not affecting anything. And then I can just make a selection. So I could do this with the quick select and see how well that does. That looks actually pretty good. Just to make sure it gets all of the pixels, I'm going to switch to my lasso tool and hold down Shift to add to this selection, making sure that it goes all the way out here. If I turn off the other sheath layer, I'm actually just going to go ahead and extend this into the part that's covered up anyway, just for safety. Make sure that I don't have anything that I shouldn't selected, and then just catch these little pixels right here. That should be good, and then I'll probably end up feathering this out anyway. But that should cover all of my bases, and I can just fill that with white now. Option delete to fill with the foreground color. And now just that part of the image is brighter. And maybe I want to make that just a tad brighter. There we go. Zoom out a little bit to see how that looks. And I think that's pretty convincing. If you're looking at it from a distance and you didn't know these were two different photos, you're probably never going to be able to tell. If I zoom in nice and close here, that even looks pretty clean around the edge. There's just a slightest bit of glow, but you're never going to see that. It's going to be further zoomed out, so it's not going to be noticed at all. I'll save that, close out that smart object, and there it updates. Alright, so now that I've fixed that little issue, everything else with the cutout looks pretty great to me. Now I want to think about how can I treat this photo to just give it a little bit of a style. Well, if you remember, the vibe that I was going for was kind of this campy, 70s, 80s, gritty, bad transfer to VHS kung fu movie style. And one thing that I use a lot to kind of degrade the look of an image is unsharp mask. It adds a really interesting type of contrast to the image. So to apply it, I'm going to come up to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And this is going to be applied to just this half of the sheath because it's a separate layer than the katana. So just pay attention over here, but you can actually see pretty well the difference between this side and this side. The way this effect works is it's basically looking for areas of existing contrast, like things right in here between the fingers with those shadows and the red touching up against the black. and it's going to exaggerate that contrast even more. So it's not a uniform contrast over the entire image. It's looking for existing contrast and then exaggerating it. And you have controls for the amount, so I could really punch this up, as well as a radius. The radius is basically how far beyond that contrast is this effect going to increase the contrast even further. So if I turn it way down, it's actually not that noticeable. If I turn the preview off and back on, you can see right in here especially, it gets this nice little pop. And it kind of just actually makes it look blurry when you turn it off because of how much more contrasty and gritty it looks. But if I turn the radius up even further, you can see how that kind of just starts to blow it out, and it almost gets a little glowy. I don't want to go too far in that direction and make it look like that, but I do want to push it out a little bit because, like I said, this kind of degrades the way that it looks, and that's what I'm going for. I want something that looks a little bit degraded, like it was from the 70s or 80s, and potentially even transferred to a VHS tape. So I don't need to go too crazy with it. The amount is pretty strong right there, but maybe around 100 and then radius around 5 or 6. That looks pretty cool to me, and like I said, when you turn that off, it almost looks blurry because of how much contrast it's adding, so it is pretty easy to overdo this. I might bump it down even just a little bit, but somewhere around there probably is going to work fine. I'll click OK, and now that that's applied, I can just transfer it over to my Katana layer by holding down Option or Alt on a PC, clicking and dragging that smart effect to that layer, and there we go. It's now applied to both halves of that artwork. So that's the first step. I think that's pretty cool. Something else that's pretty typical of bad transfers of film to VHS is the brightest brights are not as bright as they should be, and same with the darks. They're not as dark as they should be. The contrast is basically off. So to kind of simulate that, I can also do this with the curves, but I'm going to apply it directly to the layer. So I'm going to press Command or Control M on a PC to apply that directly to the sheath. And what I'm going to do is just, instead of adding contrast or brightening or darkening the image like this, I'm going to take the highlights or the whites, the brightest parts of this, the brightest pixels in this layer, and just drag them down. I don't want to go too far, but you can see that's bringing these brightest points right here to be much darker. Let me zoom in here so we can see nice and close. And I just want to take that brightest point off a little bit, something like that, and then I'll do the same thing for the blacks, but in the opposite direction. I want to make them a little bit brighter. So we're just losing some contrast there, basically dulling that image just a tad. And obviously this is not something you'd want to do all the time with any project, but with this specific one, since I'm trying to degrade the look of the image a little bit, I do want to do that. So that's with and without. Alright, and from here I could add a little bit of contrast back in just by adding in a tiny amount of an S-curve here. So bringing up the brighter parts up just a little bit and the darker parts down just a little bit. Alright, I like that. I'll click OK and then again bring that over to the Katana layer. And there we go. Now one thing that I do want to point out is that the effect layer matters. It's going to apply these from the lowest effect up. So if I took off both of these, first what's happening is it's applying the unsharp mask, and then it's going to drop the contrast down with that curves. So if I were to add another effect, say saturation, and I just increase that a whole lot, that's at the top now, that's being applied after everything else. But if I drag that down below the curves where we just lowered the contrast, you see that those colors updated. I'll undo and redo. So this is why the effect order matters. Now, between the curves and the unsharp mask, that doesn't really make much of a difference, but it is something you need to be aware of so that when you are stacking multiple effects, you realize they're starting at the bottom, it's taking the original image, applying that first effect, and then stacking all the other effects on top of it. Okay, so I think I've got the pixels looking the way that I want them to. You can see just how different they are with those two effects, comparing this artboard to this artboard. But what I want to do now is make it look a little bit more like it's in this yellow environment by adding a light wrap. And it doesn't have to be a very extreme one. Pretty subtle is fine, but I just want to again add that inner glow. So double click on the layer to get into the layer styles, and then we'll use that inner glow. So I'm going to sample that background color, click OK, Turn up the opacity so I can really see it and zoom in nice and close. When you're in the layer style panel, by the way, if you just press Command or Control plus or minus, you can zoom in and out, and holding down the space bar still allows you to pan temporarily. Alright, so there we go. I've got that little glow. I'm going to pump up the size. I don't want it to be crazy big, something like that, and then turn the opacity way down, just so we get that tiny little bit of light wrap. That looks good. I'll click OK. Copy that over by holding down Option or Alt, dragging it over to the katana, and now I've got my light wrap. Alright, so that's a pretty good start to the overall look. Now let's think about the background and see if maybe we can use any of those paper textures that I had included in my stock images to see if we can just give it some more substance to that background. So I'm going to open up my stock images. Let's see, under Images, Stock, and then we have these paper textures. So I'm just going to grab one that has some good, dust and stuff in it. That one looks pretty good. And I'm going to drag that over. And that's exactly the same as going up to File, Place, Embedded. I'm going to rotate this, holding down Shift to snap it to the 45-degree increments, and then scale it up so it fills the entire page. Now this is a really high resolution image, so I could make this much bigger if I needed to, but I'll just call it good there, hit that check mark, and then what I want to do is use this as a texture that's overlaid on top of the rest of the document. And we're going to use a blend mode to do this. Remember, this is your blend mode menu, and we've already looked at things like multiply and screen. Multiply will remove all of the bright pixels, so the 100% white pixels disappear, and everything below that gets blended on top of the image, and it's preserving the 100% black pixels. So that's going to give me all of that dark texture and basically remove the paper. If I were to set this to screen instead, it's going to do the opposite. It gets rid of all the pure black and blends everything that's a little bit brighter than black and preserves 100% white. But everything between 100% white and 100% black is blended on top of the image. So that's why it looks like it's getting brighter. There's one more option though called overlay, and this is kind of the halfway point between those two extremes. It's going to take all the darks and blend it into the image based on its intensity. It's going to take all the lights, blend that into the image, again based on the intensity, and it's going to take the 50% mark, the 50% gray, and that will not exist. It's going to blend it completely out and keep all the darks and keep all the lights. But it blends it in a way that's not as intense as multiply or screen. Now if I move this below the sheath in the katana, then it won't affect that. But it is affecting the background. Now, this might be a little bit too intense for what I want to do. You don't really see that texture in there. It's very difficult to see. But if I increase the contrast on this a little bit, I might be able to bring out some of that texture a little bit better. So I'm going to press Command M to bring up my curves, and I'm going to pull this over. This is the same thing as grabbing this point and dragging it over, but instead of being able to move it up and down, I'm only able to move it to the right. So I'm going to grab those darks and bring them over to this side of the histogram. This is telling me where the darkest parts of the image are, where the darkest pixels are. So I'm basically just sliding this over, making those darkest pixels pure black. Everything that is darker than that also becomes pure black. But doing that, you can see, brought in a lot of those darker pixels. And then I could grab the whites and do the same thing, bring them up to make the brightest parts of that image even brighter. And now that texture comes through a lot better. Zooming in nice and close, you can really see all of that texture showing through again. So I'm going to rename this layer really quick, Overlay, and just to give you a clear example of what's going on, I'm going to make another copy and call this one Multiply, and I'm going to make one more and call it Screen. Then I'm going to turn off Overlay and Multiply. We'll focus just on this one and turn it to Screen. So what this is doing is removing all of the pure black and blending everything that's brighter than pure black into the image. The brightest pixels, the 100% white pixels, stay 100% white. They don't get blended in at all. And to make this even clearer, I'm going to move it above the sheath. So there you can really see all that texture coming through. Because we added so much contrast, it's really, really gritty. If I turn that curves off, you see that it basically just washes everything out. But none of those black pixels are there anymore. There's a hole right there where some of that texture was. Alright, now let's turn that off, put the multiply layer up, change the blending mode to multiply, and then look at this again. Now it's much, much darker because we're getting rid of all of those bright pixels and keeping those darkest pixels. Everything that's pure black doesn't get blended at all. Everything above it does. But overall, it's making the entire image much darker. And then finally we have overlay. If I turn that on, you can see that it still is affecting the image, but it's doing it in a way that is both brightening pixels and darkening pixels, not just one or the other. I want to stick with overlay because it's taking the most detail out of that paper texture. If you only were concerned with these little dusts and specks and scratches, then just use multiply. Then you're just going to get those dark parts and you can get rid of all of the bright paper texture. But this way I'm going to get both those specks and the actual fibers, the texture of that paper that we see in these kind of vertical lines, and I like that. So I'm going to keep that, but I'm not going to put it over top of these images, just on top of the background. So let me get rid of multiply and screen, and I want to point one more thing out, and that is that this texture image was not pure white. The paper had some color to it. I'm going to turn the blend mode off of overlay so we can see there is color there. And because there is color there, when it's blending into the background color, it's going to affect that color. So let me change that back to overlay and then turn it off and back on. It's pretty subtle because it is fairly desaturated, but it is affecting the background color. If I press Command U to bring up my hue and saturation and increase that saturation, and then change the hue, you can see that's actually affecting the colors below it. It's much more green now. And that's because that saturation affects what's below it when it's set to a blending mode. So what I actually want to do is reset this and turn the saturation all the way down. Click OK, and now my image is actually completely desaturated. There is no color data in it. It's just a grayscale image, and that's all I want. I want to take those grayscale pixels and apply them to the background color without affecting the color itself, just making it brighter or darker, the value of that color, not the hue and not the saturation. So there we go. I'm going to set that back to overlay. And now my background color is pretty much preserved. It's just brighter or darker depending on what part of the texture is overlaying it. Alright, I want to take the highlights off just a little bit. So I'm going to go back into that curves and push the whites over just a little bit. And then maybe bring the darks in just a tad more. There we go. Click OK, and there's before and after. So I just made the background just slightly darker, but you can compare it to the other artboard and see that the yellow is almost exactly the same. It just now has texture. Alright, the next step, because this is supposed to be something that was potentially shot on film, I kind of want to add in some film grain and kind of maybe simulate that cinematic look and maybe potentially not using the highest quality film grade so that it is pretty dirty and grungy. So to do this, I could apply the texture directly to the layers, but if the animator ends up deciding they want to incorporate this grain, I know because I've used After Effects and I've done this type of thing before that I want that grain to be animated. You know, film grain isn't a static still image. It's something that happens on every single frame when the film was exposed to light. So the grain is going to change from frame to frame, and if I give them the grain straight on the graphic, they can't animate it. But the animator can generate grain very easily in After Effects. So what I want to do is just make a new layer that has grain in it so that they can easily turn it off if they don't want it and they want to animate it instead. So what I'm going to do is just make a new empty layer right on top of my graphics, and I'll call this grain. And while I'm at that, I need to change this to texture, and actually I'll call it background texture, and that way that is clearly labeled. And I want to fill this with 50% gray. So I'm going to bring up my color picker, change the brightness to 50%, and then fill. So there I have a 50% gray layer, and the reason I did 50% gray is similar to why we used overlay, because this is going to add grain in both a brighter and a darker direction, and not just brighter and not just darker. If I were to do black, it can only add lighter grain. If I did white, it could only add darker grain. Because I did right down the middle of the road, it can go in either direction. So I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise, and then zoom in to 100%, Command 1, just so I can see how much texture that's going to add. And I think that might work. Maybe bump it up just a little bit like that. Gaussian monochromatic. If I turn off monochromatic, it's going to make color grain. I think I want to keep it monochromatic. but somewhere around there. Maybe just increase that a little bit. So it's nice and easy to see. Click OK, and then I want to set that to overlay. And there we go. It's applied that grain, blended it into the overall image. If I turn it off and back on, you can see it's not really affecting the brightness or the color at all of my document. It's just adding this gritty texture, and that's what I wanted. Now, it might be a little too exaggerated. It's very visible on these hands, but when you zoom out, it becomes much less apparent, and especially once it's animated, it's not going to be seen very much at all. So I think I actually will leave it exactly how it is, and I think this frame might be done. Let me just undo back to where I opened this so we can compare. We went from this completely unstyled image, just cut out straight from the stock photos, slapped onto the yellow background, to here where we've applied some contrast adjustments. We've added that unsharp mask, we added the inner glow, the grain, the background texture. I think that really adds a lot. So now that I've got that going for me, I need to transfer it to the rest of my boards. So let's just start by transferring over to Artboard 2, which should be very easy since it's the exact same shot. The sheath is just open. So first I'll grab the grain and the background texture, hold down Option, and then drag that into Artboard 2. And those should go exactly where they're supposed to. I just need to rearrange the order so that background texture is only over the background. And then I need to transfer over the smart effects and the layer styles. So I'll do the smart filters first, Option, click and drag, and then the actual layer styles. Because those are the same on both layers, I can now just copy these ones over to the Katana layer. And there we go. Now that's already done. Both of those artboards are consistent, and I can continue applying these effects to all my other elements through the entire document. So I'm going to time-lapse some of this. Again, if I do anything new, I will stop and explain myself. Now this layer in particular, this potato slice, had a curves applied to it already. You can see that was preserved, but I want to make sure that I don't copy that over to my other potato slices because it will include that original adjustment I made that the others don't need. Now I don't need to apply this to the text layers or to this logo lockup because they're just flat colors. There's nothing to them, so adding more contrast isn't actually going to do anything. So I'm not applying these smart effects or anything else to those layers. Okay, so I've transferred all of the smart filters, all of the layer styles across all the artboards to every element that needs them. And as you can see, not every single one of them turned out perfectly, and that's to be expected. I set these effects up to work with this bright yellow background, so it's not working nearly as well on this purple background or even the green background, and some of the elements are really blending into each other. So from here I need to go through each board and make fine-tune adjustments to get them looking pretty balanced and like they go with their background. For instance, I put a yellow inner glow on everything, but that doesn't make sense for the backgrounds that aren't yellow. So let me find this layer right here, the bullet split, and change the inner glow to be the red color. Now I don't want to sample the texture, so I'm going to turn that off for a second and find, or got to turn off the grain too, find that red color and sample it, click OK, and then make sure that it is affecting the image in the way that I actually want it to. So turning up just a little bit to give it a little bit more edge, click OK, and then turn those texture layers back on. Alright, another thing I'm noticing is that that texture in the background is way more intense on the red than it is on the yellow. So I'm going to grab that red texture layer, and to reduce that texture, all I'm going to do is lower the opacity. So I'm just going to turn that down maybe around 50 or even less. I don't want that to be crazy intense, just a subtle background texture. So looking at the yellow, looking at the red, I think that's a little bit more consistent. So around 45% for that red background. Alright, that's good for that frame for now. Let's move to the green. And I think same thing with that background texture, it's way too intense. So let me get to that layer and turn it down to 45. Quick tip, you can obviously turn the opacity down like this, but your numbers on the top row of your keyboard, if you pressed 5, it's going to drop down to 50%. If you press 7, it'll go to 70. And if you type two numbers quickly, like 4-5, you'll get to 45%. So that's a quick way to adjust the opacity of layers. I think that little bit made that texture a little less intense, and that's working now. Compare it to this one. Much more subtle. But I think that the contrast adjustment on these layers was a little bit too much, and because this background layer was so much brighter, these still popped off the background. But right now, these are blending a little too much into the background for my taste. So I'm going to grab that curves adjustment and then maybe increase the white a little bit so it's a little bit brighter, and basically just move everything up a little bit. So there we go. Click OK. Undo, redo, and there you can see that pops off the background just a little bit better. I want to do a similar thing to all of my potato slices, and it looks like even this one might need a little bit more adjusting. It looks much brighter than the rest of them. But I'm going to make that same type of adjustment right now. And now that I'm here, I'm seeing what the problem was. I missed that potato bottom layer when I was applying all of the other adjustments. So let me apply those really quickly and get rid of that first curves adjustment that did not need to be applied to that particular layer. And then I'm actually going to change this inner glow from being on each layer to just the layer group, because I want it to affect that as if it was one solid layer, not two separate pieces of that bottom part of the potato. Now the potato peels on these three slices are looking a little bit more saturated and maybe more contrasty than the other layers. So I'm going to find one of them. Let's start, actually just do this one right here. Potato slice 2, because it's nice and thick, and I'll zoom in here. That color is a little intense, so I need to look at what I could do to turn that saturation down. And it looks like I'm just going to need to add a hue and saturation adjustment. So press Command U to add a hue and saturation adjustment. You could also come up to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and I'll turn that down a little bit, somewhere around there, to match the saturation of the bottom peel and the top peel. That looks pretty good. I'll click OK, and then I just want to see what happens if I move that below the unsharp mask. There, it made it just a little bit lighter. I think that's the way I want to go with this. I want to put the hue and saturation, lowering the saturation a little bit, then the unsharp mask, then the curves. So I'll just copy this over by Option dragging that specific effect to the other potato peel layers. And now all of those are much more consistent. I think that's going to work for that frame. And I'll move on to the next one. Now I'm going to again start with that background texture, drop it down to 45, and then move on with the rest of the image. Something I forgot to do here was change my inner glow on all of these layers, so I need to do that quick. Make sure I sample that green color without that grain so it stays consistent. And you can see my layers are getting very messy, so I'm going to collapse everything that I can so I can see more of my layers at once. There we go. There's my background texture. Turn that off. Sample that green for the inner glow. And there we go. And actually I want to apply this inner glow not to both the potato and the plate. Again, I just want it to be on the outside image, basically, as if the green was bleeding into that. It wouldn't reach the potatoes. So I'm going to make sure to take that inner glow off of that layer so that we don't tint that green at all. It's only going on the plate right there. I'll do the same thing on this layer. Looking at this frame, I think the cutting board is blending into that carrot a little too much. I want the carrot to be more visible than it is. So I think I'm going to need to take the contrast off of that cutting board. So let me find that layer. And then go into its effects and find that curves. And then just turn everything darker, so that that just really gets dark and washed out in the background. And then increase the brightness of the carrot. And this is a bunch of different pieces. I'll stick with the bottom part, the base, first. Grab those curves and then just lighten everything up a little bit. I want to make sure that it's both bright enough to pop off that cutting board and stand out against that background. Something like that is probably going to work. Copy that and then apply that same curves adjustment to all the other slices. And I think the carrots are looking a little bit pale. It probably has something to do with the curves adjustment. So what I'm going to do is change the blending mode of that effect specifically by double-clicking on these little arrows right here and changing the blending option specifically for that curves adjustment. And I'm going to change it to luminosity so it's only affecting the brightness and not the color. the way that I set up that curves, it was actually not only decreasing the contrast, but also decreasing the saturation. So if I turn it to luminosity, it's only going to affect brightness and not the color. And you can see that tip of the caret is so much more saturated now than the rest. So I'll just make that adjustment on all these curves, and we should be good to go. Alright, now obviously the texture on this purple background is way too intense. I might need to turn it down even further to something like 30%. And the grain as well is actually really, really visible on top of this. So maybe I want to turn that down to something around 40% as well. Maybe not quite that far, maybe 70%. And then turn the background texture down to say even 20. That way it's just barely given some texture there in the background, and the grain isn't overtaking everything. But if I turn those two off, you can see how just that little bit of texture really adds a lot to this entire frame. Alright, then I'm just going to copy those two layers over to Artboard 9 and delete the other two. Reposition these, and there we go. That matches up now. And there we go. I've applied all of those effects to all of my frames, and just looking at them as a whole now, I'm basically looking for consistency in contrast and color. I don't want anything being more saturated or less saturated than anything else. I want all of the contrast with the backgrounds to be pretty consistent. And what's sticking out to me right now is this katana is brighter here than it is here or here, and even the CG render. So instead of making this one katana darker with less contrast, I actually like how visible and how much it pops off the background in this one, so I'm going to modify all of the others to match it. So I'm going to keep it at this view so I can see them all at once, and go to the CG render, and then go to the curves, and bring up these brights a little bit. So to grab those highlights, and even just that was probably a little too much. But something like this just pops it off the background, undo, redo, and that takes those brights and just makes them a little bit brighter. I think that's good. The darks on that actually might be a little too dark. So I'm going to grab that and bring it up as well. And that way we still get that kind of faded, washed out look, but it's still brighter than it was before. So there we go. I've adjusted that one. This one I definitely want to pop out of the background there because it's cutting through the frame. So let me find that katana layer, go into its curves, and make the brights a little bit brighter. And this one I actually might need to add more contrast by adding some darkness there, because it's now blending into the plate. So I definitely don't want that. So this is interesting. I might have to play around with this a little bit. Let's zoom in here and see how we can make that a little bit more visible off the plate. Instead of making it brighter, what if I turned down the darks and made that even more dark? Could even take some of the brights and bring them down. Now, I don't want it to look like it's a dirty blade or something like that, but turning that down really did make it more visible. And in this case, that might be the way to go, because making it brighter really did make that blend into the plate, and I don't want to overdo the brightness. I don't want to make it look like it's completely washed out. So I think actually making it a little bit darker is the way to go for that frame. And then on this one, I think I can make it a little bit brighter. So let's grab the curves for that one, bring up these brights just a little bit, and there we go. Now that pops off the cutting board a little bit more. We see the brightness of those hands a little bit more, and I think that's going to work out. The only thing that still bothers me is this blade right here, but because this was separate from the rest of the smart object, I can increase the brightness of just that blade. If I go into that smart object, double click on the thumbnail, go to that blade and increase the brightness here, which I've already done, but I'm going to just exaggerate it even further. I'll grab these darks and bring it up, make sure that bright gets super bright right here, that highlight, and then maybe add another point there so I can exaggerate those darks up just a little bit more. So there we go. Click OK, undo and redo, so that's just brightening that up. And it's bringing out a lot of this dirty, grimy detail. Let me save this and see what it looks like after I apply the effects. If I undo and redo, you can see that now it's brighter. And it is pretty dirty. So I might want to go in here and just clean it up a little bit with the spot healing brush. And remember, that's kind of like the automatic healing brush. To do that, I need to go into the blade source object, and then I'm going to duplicate this just so I have a backup, because this is going to be a destructive edit. And so I can actually see what I'm doing, I need to add in a temporary curves adjustment. so I can make that nice and bright and actually see all that dirt and grime that's coming out when you really exaggerate that brightness. Something like that. And then I'm going to grab that spot healing brush and just make it nice and small and start painting out these little specks in grime to try and smooth it out a little bit. I don't want it to be obvious that I retouched this, but I definitely want to try and get rid of some of these smudges. Alright, this is before and after, so I just cleaned that blade up a little bit. Remember, I'm going to keep that as a backup just in case, because this was a destructive edit. Then I'll get rid of that curves, save this smart object. Once it's done saving, I'll close out of it. There's our cleaned up version. Save, close out of this. Then it's updated over here. I can undo again, redo to see that cleaned up blade. Save, and then once again zoom out and look at this as a whole. I think those are all matching up a little bit better with brightness. And as far as the textures and the brightness, the contrast, the stylization that I've applied, these boards are finished. What I'm missing now is the 2D elements that I want to add in. And the first thing that I've had in my head this entire time, ever since I started this, I knew that when this blade opens up, I want to see kind of like a flare come off of the blade right here where the light's hitting it to kind of highlight just how sharp this is and how reflective that material is. So I want to do that, but not in a realistic way. I want to do it more in a cartoony, stylized way. And I don't really enjoy working with vectors inside of Photoshop. There are much better tools inside of Illustrator, so I'm going to jump over there to do this kind of thing. So let me get into Illustrator and make a new document the same size as that artboard, 1920 by 1080. Make sure that it's RGB color, and then make sure my artboards is set to just 1. I don't need more than 1. Click Create, and what I want to do is make a shape that kind of looks like a lens flare off of this. Now, to help me with the placement and just the context of this image, I want to temporarily copy this over into Illustrator. To do this, I need to first make a flat version of it. So I'm going to collapse all of my artboards, clean this up a little bit, and take a look at just the one that I'm concerned with, Artboard 2. What I want to do is make a flat version of this basically as if it was an exported JPEG. And I could export it as an image and then bring it into Illustrator, but I can actually do this a little bit quicker. And there's kind of a crazy keyboard combination to get this to happen. I don't actually remember learning this, I just know that I've been using it forever. So I actually don't know where the command is. If you go to the Layer menu, you can find Merge Visible and Flatten Image. If I click on Merge Visible, it's going to take everything and merge it into one layer. Obviously, I do not want to do that, so I'm going to hit Undo. But if we take a look at the keyboard shortcut, that is Shift-Command-E, or probably Shift-Control-E on a PC. But if I add one more key into the mix on that keyboard shortcut, all I have to do is press Shift-Command-Option and then E. That's going to take all of the visible layers and merge them into a new layer. And in this particular case, it's doing it only on this artboard, my active artboard. So there we go. Now I have a single flat layer that I can then copy by pressing Command A to select all, press Command C to copy, go over to Illustrator, Command V to paste, and there we go. I have this in here. I can line it up to the center of my document and then lock it by pressing Command 2. There's my reference image, totally temporary, very easy, didn't have to export anything, and I can delete this reference layer out of Photoshop. Alright, now let's go back into Illustrator and design this flare. I kind of want it to be a diamond shape, and I'm going to base this off of a square. So first I'm just going to make a perfect square with a white fill, and then rotate it to be a diamond, and then I want to add an effect to this. So under the Appearance tab, this Effects button, I'm going to come down to Distort and Transform and say Pucker and Bloat. What this is going to let me do is bend out those paths or bring them in, and this is the kind of shape that I wanted to make. I knew that I could do this inside of Illustrator very easily, and I don't even have to adjust any paths this way, so that's why I came here. So I'll do something around there, 69%, click OK, and then align it up somewhere on this blade. Now I can position this however I want in Photoshop once I bring it over, but something like that. It is a little bit hard to see on that yellow background, so I think as a stylistic choice to kind of match the text and to serve the purpose of making it easier to see, I'm going to add a black stroke around the entire shape. Very thin, maybe 2 points, And then make sure that my fill is on top of my stroke. So I'm going to grab my appearance panel right here, drag the fill above the stroke, and there we go. Now that's on top of it, and I'll make it round caps and joins, so that rounds off on those tips there. See how that's now rounded? And maybe the pucker is just a little bit too extreme. So let me grab pucker and bloat and bring that in just a little bit, somewhere around there. All right, cool. That's my first little 2D element. I'm going to save this just so I have it, and I'm going to put it in my assets, boards, and make an Illustrator folder, and I'll call this 2D elements. Click OK. And I'm not actually going to use this Illustrator by placing it in my Photoshop document. I'm just going to copy the object. So I'm going to press Command C, jump into Photoshop, make sure I'm on the right artboard, and paste. And I want to paste this as a smart object so that I can always go back into Illustrator to adjust it if I need to, but also because this way I can scale it up and down. Press Enter to place that there, and then I can just reposition this wherever I want to. Alright, there we go. Now I want to make sure it goes below the grain. You're actually not really going to see much grain at all on top of it because of overlay. It's blending 100% into those whites and 100% into the blacks. And because this is 100% white and black, you're not going to see it at all. I want to rename this Flare. And I could transfer over these smart filters, but let me show you what that's going to do. It's going to make that white so much less noticeable, and the unsharp mask really isn't doing anything. I don't like the way that looks at all, so I'm going to undo, and for now I think I'm going to leave it at a pure white. I might change that a little bit later. I might change my mind with that, but for now I'm going to leave it just as it is. Now every time I try and grab this, it's grabbing the grain layer, so I'm going to start locking those grain layers as I come to them so I can quickly grab whatever I want to. Those grain layers are never going to change, so they can stay where they are. In fact, let me just search for grain and then lock all of them at once. There we go. Simple as that. Okay, so let's talk about the placement of this. I think I want it to be maybe right in the middle. Let me bring out some guides for this artboard so I can see right where the center is. And I don't know, maybe not right in the middle like this, because that's kind of covering up the blade, but it could even be off to the side over here a little bit. I think I like it better off to the side rather than straight there in the middle. But there we go, something that highlights that blade sharpness. I like that. For this next frame, there isn't much going on, right? I just got this one CG render on top of the textured background. I think I could add some impact to that bullet splitting if I had some kind of like lines that were coming off that kind of look like sparks hitting off that blade. So I'm going to flatten this layer, just like, or artboard, just like I did for the previous one. Command Option Shift E or Control Alt Shift E on a PC. Select all, Command A, Command C to copy, and then go into Illustrator, and I'll make a new artboard just to preserve this one, and then paste there. There we go. Lock that with Command 2, and then let's think about this. Now, to stay with this whole 2D vector-looking graphical style and the thin outlines, I think I could probably make these sparks happen with just a really interesting dashed line or group of lines. So let me just add a straight line with the pen tool, something like this, and make sure the outline is white, or the stroke rather, and then turn that stroke point up to maybe 2. Alright, I'm going to round off the caps and the corners and zoom in nice and close here. And I basically want this to split off in a bunch of different directions, pivoting around where it hit the bullet. So let me just make this a little bit bigger, and probably in both directions, and then just copy it and paste in front, Command F. Then with my rotation tool, R on the keyboard, I'll just rotate it a little bit, and then maybe scale it down. Now I want to make sure that Scale, Strokes, and Effects is off, so that I'm not changing the width of this path, just the size, and then scale it in just a little bit. Doesn't have to be a lot. And then just copy that one, paste in front, rotate it the opposite direction, maybe scale it up a little bit. I'm pretty much just doing this arbitrarily. Copy, paste, rotate, scale it, scale it down, and then let's do one more. Rotate, scale, and there we go. Now we've got these lines splitting off of that blade, and kind of just fracturing in each direction. Now I'm going to be putting this underneath the blade probably in Photoshop, so don't worry about that overlapping part right now. But on top of this, I want to add in some variation in the stroke by adding a really interesting dash. So I'm going to start by just clicking on one of them, going into my stroke options, and then turning on dashed line. Now these are all exactly the same length, dashes and gaps right now. To see this a little bit easier, I'm going to go to View, here we go, View, and then turn off my edges. That's also Command H, and that way I don't see that blue outline or overlay of my path on top of there as I'm adjusting this. So let me go back into there and now just play around with the dashes and the gaps. You see that I have multiple options, so let me increase the gap size to say 50, and then go to my second dash and make it 100, and then the next gap will say 83 or 86, and then the next dash to be 48, and then the last gap to be 12. Let's see what that looks like. So that gives me an interesting pattern. Maybe the first dash should be 32. And I'm really just playing around with these numbers randomly, but you can see how they're updating. So maybe this gap right here is not big enough. I'll say 48, and we'll say 28 on this gap, and I'm just playing around with this to see how it affects everything. 45 here, and now I've kind of just got a random dashed line that I can apply to these other layers. So let me press Command H so I can see my selection better now. Press I to get my eyedropper and click on that. And there we go. Now I've got a bunch of random dashes that kind of look like they're sparks flying off of the blade. Now, if you look at the ends, you can see that that pattern is identical on all of them. They all start with this tiny little one, and then the bigger one, and so on. I want to change this up a little bit, and to do this, I can just grab that, go into my stroke options, and then change this right here to preserves exact dash and gap lengths instead of fitting it to the path. When I do that, it shifts it up just a little bit. I don't want to do it for all of them, probably just 2 of them, so it's making it slightly different, and I get a little bit different of a pattern on the end, so it's not so repeated. I could also grab some of these and adjust the lengths just to get some more variance. There we go. Now we've got those sparks flying off of there. I do want to make sure that they're all overlapping pretty much at the same spot though. So let me take a look at this. I think this line right here needs to be adjusted just a little bit so that it's all pretty much hitting right in that point. There we go. That looks pretty good. Alright, let me save this document, copy these paths, and then bring them into Photoshop. Put them below the bullet split as a smart object, and then position them where I need them to be. Press enter, and the reason why I can't see them is because I still have that merged version of that artboard on top of everything. So there we go. Now we can see them nice and clear. I'll move this around a little bit to get that to line up right where I want it to, and that kind of looks like sparks now flying off of that bullet. Very cool. So that just adds a little graphical highlight basically to that impact, and it's kind of going to tie everything together. Once I'm through with all of these boards, having all of these elements is really going to help have a visual language that gives the style of this piece some personality. Okay, in a similar way to using those lines as sparks off of the blade, I think I want to do something pretty much the same for motion trails coming off of this samurai sword. That way we can see that motion going through. If you remember in the storyboard, there were these trails of lines coming off of the sword every time it moved around to indicate that it was moving really fast. I want to reflect that in this design by using these dashed lines that I just made in Illustrator. So let me grab this artboard and once again flatten merge it into a new layer. There we go. I'll copy that over into a new artboard. And then I just want to copy one of these lines. Actually, I just want the stroke. So I'll lock that background layer, and the stroke might even be preserved from what we were doing before. It's not. Let me eyedropper one of these, and there we go. I've got a motion trail. Simple as that, and I wasn't actually planning on doing it straight, in a perfectly straight line like this. I was originally going to arch it a little bit, but I honestly kind of like the way that it's just straight across. Even though that's not necessarily the path it would take, it's an interesting graphical choice, and I think I'm going to run with it. So let me just add maybe one more. And I'll change this up by shifting the length on it a little bit and maybe changing that stroke to be absolute rather than fitting to the path. So there we go, something like that. Maybe I'll even flip it. And you know what? The simplest way to actually vary these up would probably just be going into the stroke and changing some of these numbers. So I'll change this around just a little bit. See what I can come up with. There we go. Now I've got two unique looking strokes with all those dashes. But those two lines are kind of indicating the motion of that blade slicing through the potato. I think that's going to work out. Let me copy those, bring them into this artboard. I can get rid of that layer, paste as a smart object, and position them right about there. Maybe instead of being perfectly straight across, I'll just rotate them a little bit. That way it's not so perfectly geometric. Something like that. And I'll call this speed lines. And actually I forgot to rename this one right here. Let me find that layer and call it sparks. Alright. Keep my layers a little clean and organized, and then think about what else could use some elements like that. Maybe this katana coming through. It might be a little bit difficult with the amount of things that it's slicing through, but let's try it. So I'm going to merge this together. Command Option Shift E. Copy it over to Illustrator as reference. And then just bring these speed lines over. Make sure they're above everything. Command Shift right bracket to bring to the top. And then reposition these so that we can see them coming through. So it's probably going to be slicing down like this. And I'll make sure that I match the other stroke options so that there's some variance between those two dashed lines. I'm not sure if that would work for the animation, but it is a nice graphical element that helps convey the motion in the boards. Not everything that's in my boards is necessarily going to end up in the animation, but it is communicating the idea at least. I'm going to leave it up to the animator, I think, to decide how they want to actually handle this kind of thing. But for my boards, I'm going to leave it in, so I'm going to copy it over to here, Smart Object, get rid of my reference layer, and call that Speed Lines. And make sure they're in the right spot. Alright, I think that looks good. And now on this frame in particular, I don't think I need the speed lines because the blade is going to be moving a very small distance. It's not like it's coming up and chopping down every time. It's more like a chef's knife that's just dicing up this carrot. So I don't think I need anything on that frame. Let me zoom out and look at this as a whole again. I think it's working out pretty well so far. I've just got that nice little flare, the sparks, these speed lines, and then at the end, why don't we take one of these knives and pull it out and then have speed lines coming off of it so that we can see it's actually flying through the air. So maybe this one, this would probably be a good one to do. I'm thinking the butcher knife's going to come in first, then the chef's knife, and then this last, the smaller knife. So I'll take off the path, or just disable that path for now, so the tip is still visible, and then back it up a little bit. So it's flying through the air a little, and maybe I'll rotate it. When I go to transform this, the bounding box is gigantic. I do not know why that is. It might have something to do with the vector mask, but I'm just going to work with this, rotate a little bit, and then position it where I need it. So maybe about there. Alright, let me just see where that last frame was. Yeah, that's pretty good. Let me just move it down a little, and then we'll add in some speed lines. So let me merge this entire artboard, copy it over to Illustrator, and paste. Now that moved my artboards way over here. Let me rearrange everything. I'll go into my artboard options right there, edit artboards, arrange or rearrange all, and make it 3 columns. Click OK, and that did not work. Let me undo. I think I need to unlock everything potentially. Let me unlock these objects, go back to my properties, rearrange all, 3 columns, and spacing can be smaller, like 20 pixels. There we go. Then I can lock each one of these up again and bring in some speed lines. So let me grab maybe these two over here and just edit them to fit this knife. And I can't see them because they're behind that, so let me lock that in the background and then just add in some speed lines. Copy those, bring them into Photoshop, paste as a smart object, and make sure it's right where it needs to be. Alright, there we go. I think that is the last little bit of speed lines that I need. Looking at it as a whole, the only thing that's really bothering me now is this frame right here. I feel like this one element isn't cutting it. And now that I've seen how I can use these dash lines to add some highlights, like the sparks flying off the bullet, I think I could enhance this flare even more if I just added some more to it using those stroke lines. So what I'm going to do is actually just kind of forget about this smart object, because I can easily copy it in from Illustrator again, and just work on my Illustrator document some more. What I want to do is kind of make a light burst coming out from the center of this flare. So just, at least for now, I'm going to center this up in the frame vertically or horizontally at least, and then move it up to the top of the blade like that. And then I want to make a pattern similar to this over here. So what I'm going to do is just grab one of these and bring it over and align it to the center of this object. So there we go. It's aligned to the center. And I'm going to rotate it a little bit. But what I want to do is make sure that it's big enough to extend to the outside edges. So no matter how I rotate this now, it should always go to the outside of my artboard. And that's good. That's what I want. And I can't really see that white on top of that yellow, at least not as clearly as I want to. So I'm going to try just changing that to black and see what happens. Yeah, obviously that's way easier to look at. So I'm going to just put that down there and then maybe make these dashes longer. So let me press Command H to hide that overlay and adjust these gaps, or dashes rather, to be bigger. So maybe 120 and then a gap of 80, a dash of 100, another gap of 120, and then another dash at 28, and a gap at 75. So there we go. Now I've got some longer dashes there, and I'm going to try and use an effect to repeat this radially around in a pattern. So let's just see what happens. I'm going to go to the Effects under my Appearance panel, Distort and Transform, and then Transform. And I'm going to just turn up my copies to, let's say, 7, turn on preview, and nothing's happening because all of those copies are just laid on top of each other. I haven't done anything to actually transform it. I've just made 7 copies of the same line right on top of each other. But if I take the rotation and just increase the angle a little bit, there you can see it's now shifting that around. And if I just keep adjusting this, you can see that it's going in a little bit more of a random pattern. So I'm just going to keep messing with this until I get something that I like, and even maybe just use the keyboard until I get something that looks maybe a little bit like that. That looks like a nice little flare burst coming off of there. I'll click on OK, and now I've got a really interesting looking element. I might want to turn the stroke up on this flare in the center just a little bit so it matches more closely, and then play with the positioning just a little bit. Maybe just rotate the entire thing a little bit. That way all these tips are coming off of those lines instead of merging into them. But I like the way that that looks. So let me grab that and this, copy them over to Photoshop together as a smart object, make sure that they're in the right spot, and then scale it up so that it's the right size. Actually, I'm just going to type in 100%, make sure these are length, 100%, so it's exactly the same size as what I had in Illustrator. And then get rid of the other smart object. Rename this one Flare, and then move it around however I need to. Now I'm instantly regretting copying both of those over together because I actually think that I want these burst lines to go in the back of the blade instead of over top of it. The flare is fine on top, but I don't like those extra lines in the background on top. So what I'm going to do is go into that smart object and find where that artboard is. There we go. Cut the flare out of it, Command X, and save. Close that out, and in Photoshop, That should be gone now, so I'll call that burst and put it below the katana and the sheath. And then I will paste again, because I cut out of Illustrator, remember, as a smart object. There we go, that flare, and I'll rename it flare. Now those are two different objects, and I can align that burst to be right in the middle, right behind that blade, so you don't see where all those points come together, and then move my flare around wherever I want it to be. So I probably do want it to keep it centered right in the center of that artboard, but then maybe just move it up just a little bit, because I don't want it overlapping the blade perfectly like this. Just shift it off a tiny bit, and there we go. Now that's working a lot better. I like going from artboard number 1, where there's nothing in the background except for the texture. You see those hands on the sheath, and then it opens up. You get this big light burst and a flare right on the blade. I think that's going to be really impactful and throw us straight into the next slow motion sequence. I think that's working out great. The next thing I want to do is take a look at the background textures, because right now I have the exact same texture on every single background, and they gave me a few different backgrounds to pick from, so I just want to look at what other assets I have. So let me go into that stock folder, and I believe the one that I'm using right now is this one right here. Let me see. I open up this smart object. If I look right here, yes, that is the same image as this one right here, but I also have this one, which has a lot of different texture to it. If we look real close, you can see it almost looks like there's a bunch of little hairs in it, so that's interesting. We've got this one right here, which also has a lot more texture inside of it, a lot of more apparent texture. And then we have this one right here, which is more just like specks, not quite so much like fibers and things like that, but just some colored flaky specks in there. So what I think I want to do to give it a little bit of variety is change up the textured background from frame to frame. Because just like that film grain is going to be different on every single frame, I think it'd be fun if the background texture was updating, almost like dust and scratches on old bad looking film. So why don't we try that? I'm going to change this second artboard, which is, yep, that's the one I'm on, and I'm just going to bring in the next texture. So this is the one that I'm using currently, so I'm going to do the next one down. Bring that in, rotate it, and make it fill that entire artboard. There we go. And then I'm going to drag over these effects, or copy them over. Option drag over here, and then set it to overlay, and turn off the original. So there we go. We've got a different looking texture there. So that just gives some variety from one frame to the next. And then we'll go to the third frame and change that texture to the third texture that I have right here. Yeah. Bring that in, rotate, scale it up, overlay, and copy over those filters. There we go. Now that one is pretty noticeable, so maybe I'll drop down the opacity of that to maybe 70 or even 40. Yeah, there we go. Alright, so let me just change the names of these. I can delete the originals. Background texture, background texture. There we go. Now I'm just going to continue the pattern throughout the rest of the boards, probably rotating and scaling them slightly differently throughout all of these. I'm not liking the way that this one is looking. I think the pattern of this paper is way too uniform, so I'm just going to skip over that one and stick to the original 3. And on this one, I think you can see that texture way too much on the green, so I'm going to turn that down to probably like 20 or maybe 30% opacity. There we go. And then scale it up a bit, maybe rotate it, and make sure it fills the entire artboard. There we go. Then I'm not a big fan of this fiber right here, so I'm just going to shift the whole thing up a little bit. Maybe fit this a little bit differently, so that I'm only using the parts of the texture that I really like. There we go. Alright, next frame. Alright, so I finished making all those texture adjustments, so each frame has a unique texture now. And then I just want to take a look at this frame right here. I don't really like the placement of this flare where it is. being so centered up. I think I'd much rather have it off to the side like this. And I might want to play with the pucker a little bit. So I'm going to go into that smart object and find that, and then maybe just pucker it in a little bit more. Something like that, so it's nice and long on the ends. Save that and see what it looks like. There we go. And now it's just a little bit tighter in the middle. It extends out further on the sides. I think I like that shape a little bit better. So we'll put that lined right to the edge of that blade. And then we're going to keep that burst in the background centered, I think. And I know I've told you that it's great to not always put things at 100% white or 100% black, but in this particular style, I just kind of feel like 100% white, 100% black on these 2D elements actually works because it's different from everything else in a way that fits the overall style of this piece. So I think I'm going to leave it as is instead of doing something like dropping down the whites a little bit and pulling up the blacks a little bit. I don't want it to lose that pop that it's got off of the background by lowering the contrast basically. So I'm going to just leave it like that and call it good. Now most of these elements are just floating in midair. There's nothing grounding them. They're disembodied hands. That's fine. But on a couple of them, say this cutting board for example, it would probably help if it just had a little bit of shading underneath it to ground it in place so it's not just sitting there, floating in midair. That way it looks like it's on a surface and you could actually be chopping on it. So I'm going to brush in some texture here. I'm going to have to find some good texture brushes for this, but I'm going to grab my Wacom tablet to do this. So let me plug that in. Alright, and I'll need a new layer right over the color fill background. So let me clean some of this up. So I'm focused on just what I need to. And make a probably duplicate of this layer. And I'll just change this to being slightly darker and maybe a little bit more red. Something like that. For now I'll just exaggerate it so it's easy to see. And then invert my mask. And then find a good brush. So let's go into maybe the Mega Pack and the effects box and find something that's just nice and gritty. Let's try this one called Noise Control and see what happens. I kind of like that. That actually kind of almost looks like watercolor brush strokes, like a brush pen. I just don't really like that color. I think it's too intense. So let me just see what I can do to make that not quite as noticeable. Maybe just like that. And then I'll clear this out and start again. I want to brush in some texture down here. Give it a little bit of a shadow. I can always come in and take some out too. Make my brush a little bit smaller. Again, I want this to kind of be a brushed on, messier look. So I'm not too worried about it being perfectly on there, but I don't want to go crazy. Alright, I think that's going to be good. I could tweak the colors a little bit if I don't like it. Like I said, I don't want to make it really obvious. I don't want it to look like blood. I just want to be a little bit darker version of that yellow. Just enough so that it actually looks like a bit of a shadow. And there we go, we've got a little shadow. Now I think I want to do the same kind of thing on this frame right here to kind of solidify these knives being thrown into the wall there. So let me do this very similar thing there. I'm going to go to that artboard and make a new color overlay. Make sure I'm in the right artboard. Duplicate this and then make it just a little bit darker. Invert that mask. Command I to invert. And then brush on some texture. And I'm going to try and do it in a way that's going to make it look like it's a shadow for this knife coming off the wall. Make it a little bit darker so it's easier to see. And there we go, just a little subtle shadow there. I made it a little bit brighter so it doesn't stand out quite so much, but it gives that a little bit of depth. We've got some solidification there on the ground for that cutting board, and really none of the other elements would be on a surface. The blade's being held up so it's not sitting on anything, and everything else is floating around in the air. So with that, I think I may have finished all 9 of these boards. Let's just take a look at all of them at once and see if there's any last little tweaks that I need to make. I like the way that everything is balanced with the contrast. They all feel very consistent. I like the 2D elements are all consistent with each other. They pop off of those photo elements in the background. The text styling is very consistent. I've got all that background texture, the film grain, and now these little bits of shading underneath some of these elements. So everything is really working the way that I want it to, but there's one last little step that I want to take to kind of just finish everything off. It's kind of like the cherry on top of everything, which is to just add some overall adjustments to both the color and the contrast. So the first thing I want to do is something we've done before, which is add a vignette. Right now everything is very, very flat, and there's nothing wrong with flat. You can make a design that is intentionally flat, but I think I can add some dynamic element to this just by adding in a vignette on each of these boards. So let's start with the first board real quick and then transfer it over to all the other boards. So I'm going to go to Artboard 1 and I'm going to use my curves adjustment layer to do this. I use curves, as you can tell by now, for a host of different applications, whether it's color adjustments, brightness adjustments, or adding something like a vignette. So I want to add this below the grain layer so that the grain is the last thing on the very top being blended on top of everything. The vignette's not going to adjust the darkness of the grain this way. I'll go into the adjustments and add a curves adjustment and call this vignette. And I don't need the layer mask, but I will add a vector mask. So let me make a circle, something about this big. It doesn't have to be a circle. And in fact, sometimes you can make more interesting organic looking vignettes if you manipulate these handles, but I'm going to start with a perfect circle and see what it looks like. So add that vector mask. There we go. And then I want to feather it out. So turn this up, probably around 200 pixels is usually pretty good. And I forgot to make it a little bit darker. I probably should have done that first. Make it a little darker, and I need to invert my mask. So to do that, I'm going to grab the path, change this from combine to subtract, and there we go. Now we've got that vignette. Now this is manipulating the color of the background and everything it's over top of right now. So I'm going to try my little trick of changing the adjustment layer to luminosity, so it's only affecting the luminosity or the brightness of those pixels and not the color. This is with color adjustments and undo without. So it's very subtle, but in the corner here you can see it gets more saturated when it's on normal, and when it's on luminosity not quite as much. I actually think I prefer having that extra boost in saturation, so I'm going to leave that at normal. And that just gives the slightest bit of darkness around the corners. That might even be more than I need. But this way, it's just bringing your eye into the center of the frame a little bit more and giving just a little bit more depth to that background. Now, like I said, we could change this up a little. I could grab these handles and make it not a live shape anymore. That's fine. But just manipulate these a little bit so it's a little bit more unique, not quite so perfect. And this is something that's obviously easy to adjust. I'm going to be giving this off to an animator who can decide whether or not they like having this vignette on it at all, if they want to increase or decrease the strength of it, or manipulate the shape. That's something that I'm going to leave up to them. But I think having just manipulating those handles adds a little bit of personality to that vignette. Again, it's subtle. It's not something I want to overdo. I want you to know that it's there more subconsciously than anything. But now that that's done, let's duplicate that over to all the other artboards and make sure it's below the grain on each of them. Alright, I'm going to look at this as a whole and make sure that the vignette isn't showing up differently on any of these. It should all be very consistent. But it is a good idea to look at all of your artboards, especially because all these colors in the background are so different. Sometimes your vignette might look a lot different on something like this red than it does on the yellow. But I actually want to adjust it on the red to exaggerate it a little more. Remember, this is kind of the intense part of the sequence where it's in slow-mo, chopping a bullet in half. So I want to exaggerate the vignette even a little bit more, and maybe even shrink it down a little bit. So you're really focusing in on that bullet. And you're noticing I don't even have to keep it in the center of the frame. I'm going to use it as a device to highlight that bullet in that section of the frame. So there it is, as it's been adjusted. This was before, this is after, so it's just narrowing in your focus on that one particular spot. Alright, I think everything else is looking pretty good. Let me just search for that vignette, and then I can turn all of them off at once and back on to see how they're affecting everything. Alright, I think that's working well. Without and with, it just brings your eye to the center of the frame. I think that's working well. One other thing that I can do to everything is just add a little bit of a color grade or a color correction. What that means is basically just manipulating all of the colors in a very subtle way to give it a distinct look. And it should be subtle. Again, I don't want to overdo this at all, but let's just start with the first frame again. And once again, I'm going to use a curves adjustment layer. This is something that we haven't really done yet in this course, but it's very helpful. So I'm going to add another curves, and I'm going to name this color grade, and again put that below the grain. I don't want to manipulate that grain. And curves can not only adjust the entire brightness of all three channels, red, green, and blue, but you can also selectively choose red, green, or blue channels and manipulate those values. So this is how I'm going to manipulate the color. If I went to the red channel and I turned the red way down by grabbing the mids and pulling it down like this, you see that it gets much more green because I'm pulling a lot of the red out. Or if I go in the opposite direction, it's going to make everything much more red. Now obviously that's not what I want to do to this image. What I'm going to do is just make a very subtle color adjustment to everything so that it brings it all together a little bit. And this type of color correction is something that I've done a lot with my own work. It's not something I'm just doing randomly. I've done it a lot, so that's why I know how to do this. But I'm going to start on the red channel, and I'm going to make a slight S-curve. And you know, S-curves usually look like this, right? With your curves. I don't want to go anywhere near that much. I'm just looking at this vertical or diagonal line right here going through, and I want to raise up the brights just a little bit, and I want to pull down the darks just a little bit, so that you just get this slight S-curve there. Then I'm going to go to the green channel, and I'm going to do the same thing. Grab here, pull it up just a little bit, grab here, pull it down just a little bit, and there we've got that S-curve. And then I'm going to go to the blue channel, and instead of adding in a curve, I'm just going to grab the dark blues and pull them up a little bit. See, that brings in some blues into the shadows there. And I'm going to grab the highlights of the blues and pull them down. If I really exaggerate this, you see it makes everything super yellow because I'm basically taking all of the blue out of that channel. I just want to drop it off a little bit and now turn this curves layer off and back on. So you can see what that's doing. It's just giving a little bit of contrast to the red and to the green channels. I'm going to exaggerate this one a little bit more. And then it's taking out blue from the highlights and adding in blue to the shadows. So it's just giving the overall color a little bit of stylization. I definitely don't want to overdo it, so I'm going to back that blue off a little, but here's without and with. So I think that overall color adjustment makes for something that just looks a little bit more stylized. I think that's going to work, and I'm going to copy it over to my other artboards. Again, making sure it goes below the grain. Alright, there we go, looking at it as a whole again. I'm going to search for that color grade adjustment layer and turn them all off. That's without, and then back on. That's with. So there you go. I've given everything a vignette to bring your eye to the center of the frame, and I've given a little bit of a color grade that's just given a little bit of style. Very subtle, but a little bit of a style to the overall colors. And remember that I did this with adjustment layers, and that was very intentional, because if I was working with a brand's color, I would be manipulating their colors, applying this color grade, and they might not like that. So keeping it non-destructive as an adjustment layer is going to allow me to make adjustments later on in the process if I need to. Or even the animator. The client might not realize that the colors have been adjusted until the animation phase, so this is allowing that animator to make adjustments if they need to according to the client's notes. Alright, with all of that, I think I finally finished everything off. It's looking exactly the way that I want it to, and I can get this ready to export. What I need to do first, before I export, is just rename all of my artboards, because they are exported with the file name being the same as what the artboard is named. So I'm just going to call this Ninja Gear Katana 01, and then replace that, or sequence that all the way up. Alright, now it's ready to export, so I'm going to come up to File, export, export as, and this will allow me to export all of my artboards at once. I want to make sure that I export them as JPEGs and at 100% quality. That's going to increase the file size a little bit, but it's going to allow me to present this in the highest quality possible to the client. So I'm going to make sure that's set to 100. It is, and they're all set to JPEG, so I can now just hit Export All. I'll navigate to my Assets Boards folder, and inside the boards I'll make a new folder called Output, and then I'll make a V1 folder in here just in case the client has any revisions. That way I can make a V2 and export the same boards into that new folder. Click on Open. Photoshop will export everything out, and then let's take a look and make sure that exported correctly. There's my output V1, and sure enough, here are all of my boards, nice and clean, high resolution, with all of my stylizations, effects, and finishing touches. Alright, this is ready to go to the client, so I'm going to get it wrapped up and sent off.